So our next speaker is our ZISC faculty member, Kenny Paterson. Kenny is a well-renowned expert in the field of applied cryptography. His research is about designing, analyzing systems and applications that use cryptography. Kenny is also a master in breaking systems that use cryptography the wrong way. I believe today we are going to hear about why designing end-to-end encrypted cloud storage is difficult. Please.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Let me just, first of all, add my congratulations to those expressed by earlier speakers. ZISC is a great success. It was something I heard about long before I joined ETH Zurich, and it was one of the things that made me think this would be a fantastic place to come and work. We've been here now, my group has been in operation for about 5 years, and it's been a real pleasure to join the ETH community here and be part of ZISC. So thank you to Serjan and everybody else who's been involved in making it such a great success. Today I wanted to give you a very brief glimpse into some of the research that we've been doing in my research group in the area of cloud storage, specifically end-to-end encrypted cloud storage. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a few slides' time. Here's a brief overview. I'm going to motivate the need for end-to-end encrypted cloud storage. And I'm going to then very briefly touch on 2 case studies that we've done in my research group, one on Mega and the other on Nextcloud, and I'll talk a little bit about what they are in a few slides' time. Try to draw some lessons from that, then talk about the latest work that we're doing where we try to move from attacking systems to building the formal foundations for end-to-end encryption for cloud storage, and then a little bit of a look ahead into the future. So let's start by a little bit of motivation. There are market predictions that say that something like 100 zettabytes of data will be stored in the cloud by 2025. I don't actually know what a zettabyte is, but it sounds big. I think it's 18 zeros or 15? It's a lot of zeros. Something like 50% of all of the world's data will be stored in the cloud by 2025, according to these market surveys. And here, in a kind of a typical consumer application, the users are maybe capable of remembering passwords, but we're not going to be handing out security tokens to them, not just yet anyway. And so the only kind of security information they can make use of in authenticating themselves to the system, accessing the system and so on, will be a memorable password. On the other side, we have a server which is going to store our data, store the user's data, and of course the users want to have access to core functionalities, like authenticating to the system using their password perhaps, uploading files, downloading files, and particularly, and this turns out to be one of the places where security often goes wrong, sharing files with other users in the system. And of course, there are very large vendors in this space, and I put some logos here for Google, Microsoft, Apple, I think on the top right and the bottom left is Dropbox. And all of these services today do offer encryption services for data stored in the cloud, but by default, they're all using keys that are controlled by the server, not by the user. What does that mean? Well, that's great for example, allowing the service provider to do data mining on the data in order to build better AI models so they can separate cats from guacamole. There's no cats and guacamole involved in this talk beyond that. No cats were harmed in particular. It also allows them to do things like deduplication, so they can identify when distinct users are uploading copies of the same file and then only store one copy. And that's estimated to save something like 50 to 70% of storage in consumer-oriented cloud storage systems. On the other hand, we live in a world where we have to deal with compromises, and we have to deal with the possibility that in this kind of scenario, the server may be compromised. In particular, it might be compromised by hackers who are interested in getting access to the data that's stored there, or there may also be situations where access to the data is compelled by a government or by law enforcement agencies of a government. And there are numerous examples of this kind of thing happening. So rather than relying on keys that are under the control of servers, there's emerging these days a new set of service providers where the encryption is done under keys that are controlled by the user, and only the user. And in particular, the service provider or the server is not able or should not be able to get access to the data. And I've put on this slide the logos of some of the more prominent companies in this space. Something you notice about these companies as compared to these companies is that in the majority of cases, they include their own name in the logo. And this is something you have to do when you're small and you're starting out. Also, they're almost universally blue. There's something about security and the color blue. I guess the psychologists would have something to say about that. So we're increasingly seeing these services being launched. Initially, generally speaking, at a fairly small scale compared to the likes of AWS or Microsoft or Google, but with a lot of growing interest and a lot of excitement about what kind of security they can provide. Of course, if the keys are controlled by the user, you now remove the possibility for things like deduplication and data mining. You can see that as a positive or negative, depending on where you sit. It also increases challenges for things like data recovery. If a user in the end loses their password or their authentication access, maybe they lose also the ability to recover and decrypt their data. So there's also significant usability challenges in building these kinds of systems. So I wanted to switch now to talk about Mega, the first of our two case studies. So Mega has been around for a long time. Some of you may have heard the name Kim.com. He was one of the founders of the original Mega service. Mega has been reborn, and Kim.com is no longer involved. The FBI are still interested. And so one of the interesting things about Mega is actually it has significant scale. They claim on their website to have more than 280 million registered users. I don't know whether that's daily active, monthly active, or whatever, but that's the number they have. They're all paying money for access to the service, and they store in total more than 1,000 petabytes of stored data. That's tiny compared to 100 zettabytes, but it's still a significant amount of data if you're thinking about potentially having to change your encryption algorithm, which, as we'll see, maybe Mega needs to do. Mega makes extremely strong security claims for their service. In particular, they promise users that they themselves are not able to access user data. So here's something from the website that I cut and pasted just the other day. We'll just read it out. We protect your data with zero-knowledge encryption, the highest level of online security and privacy. Now, I don't know what the technical definition of zero-knowledge encryption is. I think it's beyond NCCA security, for those of you who think about security definitions. But it's clearly meant to convey something, that Mega has zero knowledge about your data, your keys, or whatever, okay? And so for anyone else, including Mega, the data would appear as gibberish, and they would find it impossible to read or understand. Okay, so that's a pretty high security bar that Mega is setting for their system. And in particular, it prompts us to imagine the situation where Mega themselves, or the service provider themselves, is adversarial, where they're willing to try to modify the protocols that users are using to interact with the system to maybe get some kind of decryption capability, okay, or recover users' data. So in particular, it leads us to think about a strong threat model where the service provider itself is malicious and is trying to access customer data. After all, that's what Mega claims is the case. And the goal in such a threat model for the attacker would be to violate the confidentiality or the integrity of user data. Now, this is the only sort of technical picture I'm going to show, really, when discussing Mega. It's just to show you that Mega has a complex key hierarchy involved in their system, involving encryption keys, master keys, file keys, key pairs, RSA key pairs, and so on and so forth, right? So there's quite a lot of complexity here, quite a lot of moving parts, cryptographically speaking, all of them interacting with each other. If we want to violate confidentiality or integrity of user data, then what we really want to do as an attacker is recover the user's RSA private key, SK, in this key hierarchy, because if you can do that, it turns out that you can then spoof the authentication protocol and you can do various other things, and it becomes possible to decrypt files, okay? And even inject new files into the system. So that's our target for this kind of attack. And we also want to measure the attack cost of the kind of attack that we're thinking about here. And the attacks that we came up with in our analysis of Mega involve active interaction with the user, in particular abusing the user login process to learn something about the user's RSA private key. And that requires user interaction. So what we want to do is measure the amount of logins or the number of logins involved in our different attacks. Okay, good. So what did we manage to do? Well, in this paper published at IEEE Security and Privacy 2023, working with Matilda and Miro, we gave the first security analysis of Mega, and we found attacks that required about 512 logins by a user in order to recover the RSA private key of the user, and thereafter you can then do lots of other bad things. This is quite a lot of logins, and indeed, when disclosed this attack to Mega, what they said is, well, we looked through our logs and none of our users logged in 512 times, so we're probably okay. It didn't take long, however. Oh, and I should say that we did coordinated disclosure. It was really constructive. They actually said how delighted they were that we had broken their system. This was a really nice disclosure to go through. And of course, then they patched their system. So they improved the security and stopped our attacks from working. It didn't take long, however, before a follow-up work by Nadia Henninger and her PhD student Keegan Ryan from UCSD managed to decrease the number of logins required for the attack from 512 to 6. And there are users who've logged in more than 6 times. Of course, their attack was only on the unpatched version, and already the system had been patched. So this was like an attack in theory rather than an attack in practice. But it does demonstrate this fundamental truth about cryptographic attacks. They only get stronger or better with time. And then the next step was our follow-up paper written with Martin Albrecht and Lenka Marakova from King's College and Royal Holloway, respectively, and also with Miro, who by this time was a PhD student, I think, at UCSD, and me, published at Eurocrypt last year, where we got the number of logins required down to 2. Okay, and the minimum theoretical number is actually 1, so it's an open problem to reduce the number of logins to 1. Of course, it's only of theoretical interest, right, because this is against the patch system. More importantly, what we showed in our paper was that the number of logins you needed to break the patched version was only 2,500. Now, that's a big number, but it's on the same order of magnitude as the original attack. And what that shows is that their patching strategy, while it fixed the specific attacks that we had found, has some kind of long-term limited value in preventing these kinds of attacks in general. And some kind of new approach is required, maybe based on a formal analysis of this kind of setting. So we found a lot of issues in Mega that led to these weaknesses. Use of weak cryptographic primitives, the breaking a fundamental principle of cryptography, which is the key separation principle. So they had key reuse issues, using the RSA key pair, using the master key for different functions, which then interacted with each other and enabled us to get leverage to do our attacks. And then also the fact that the way that they patched was dictated by the impossibility, the practical impossibility of re-encrypting 1,000 petabytes of data. This would have taken, also the point is that only the users could encrypt and decrypt the data, or decrypt the data and then re-encrypt it under a different algorithm. So it would have taken literally months to exfiltrate all the data, change the encryption, and send it back to the data store. So if you're designing a large-scale end-to-end encrypted cloud storage system, better choose the right algorithms at the beginning. Let me switch to Nextcloud very briefly. We started looking at Nextcloud a while back because it was the second largest end-to-end encryption storage provider. And it's very interesting because it's used by ETH Zurich, amongst other prominent parties like Amnesty International and the German federal government. And again, they make very strong security claims about their inability to access your data if you use the end-to-end encryption facilities. They added a file sharing feature in 2023. And here's a little thing that I took from their website yesterday, and that timing is significant, as I'll explain in a moment, that talks about this file sharing facility. And it's the last sentence is important. It is now possible for the HR team to share their folders with confidential dossiers with each other, ! In this context of end-to-end encryption. So in other words, the data is encrypted under a key that one HR person knows, but they're somehow able to share the data with another HR person, maybe under that HR person's key, or maybe using some kind of key hierarchy. The details don't matter here. But they're talking about file sharing in the context of end-to-end encrypted data. Okay, so we did a security analysis of Nextcloud, as I mentioned. The paper will appear at EuroSNP. This involved Martin again and Matilda again, and this time Daniele, who was a master's student in my group doing a semester project. So this was really his semester thesis. And he's now a PhD student in the group of Serjan Chapkun. So it's a good success story in terms of training up our people and getting them ready to do PhDs. So what did we find? We found 3 different cryptographic vulnerabilities in Nextcloud, and each one of them was sufficient to totally break confidentiality and integrity guarantees in this malicious server setting again. In particular, one of the vulnerabilities we found exploits the file sharing feature that I mentioned before. And what's very interesting is that Nextcloud disabled this feature in order to mitigate our attacks until they could do a redesign of the entire feature. So kudos to them. They recognized that this feature was fundamentally broken, and the only thing they could do in the short term was switch off Okay, remove that capability. However, what's interesting is that yesterday, they're still advertising it as being available. This is an instance of marketing getting ahead of engineering. Okay, so much for Nextcloud. What we've observed generally from this work and in other ongoing work that we have in my group are a whole sequence of design anti-patterns that come up again and again in this line of work. I won't go through them all in detail, but I just want to highlight the last one because it points where I'm going next. In this general field of end-to-end encryption for cloud storage, there's really a lack of any kind of formality or formal specifications. Even the threat modeling isn't done very well, as far as we can tell by reading documents produced by these organizations. And there's certainly not really any formal security analysis of the systems that they're deploying. There's a lot of research from scientists, academics, in how to do this, but very little of that research seems to have made it through into the practice, as evidenced by the systems that we've been analyzing. More generally, not really a technical point, more a kind of a cultural point, there seems in this ecosystem to be a lack of maturity about how to handle disclosures, how to do secure software development, and this idea of also putting marketing ahead of security. So let me just, to give you one example, with Nextcloud, when we disclosed the vulnerabilities to them and said we want to coordinate with you on how we're going to patch these, they just started patching in their public repositories. Right? Patching security vulnerabilities in public repositories is not the greatest idea because if people are watching carefully, they can reverse engineer what the patches are for and then use that to exploit systems that have not yet been patched in practice. Okay? So you should really develop patches privately and then deploy them and then tell everybody, please update your software. So general lack of maturity in this space. So where does this point to? So in the most recent work we've been doing in the group and also with our collaborators, so here I should mention Matilda again, but also Hannah Davis, who until recently was a PhD student at UCSD, and Felix Gunther, who was in the group and is now at IBM Research here in Zurich, in Rischlikon to be precise, and Miro Haller from UCSD again. We've started to think about, inspired by all of this work, analyzing and breaking systems, look, can we do something better? Can we start building formal foundations for this problem of how to achieve security in this end-to-end sense for cloud storage systems? And so what we've done is we've designed a system, I should say, which features all of these core functionalities that you want to have. We use standardized, simple algorithms that have good performance characteristics, and we try to be pragmatic in our assumptions about what equipment users have, just their brains and the ability to remember a strong password. And the key point here, which I think separates us from a lot of the previous work in this space, is that we're also developing formal security models in which these systems can be analyzed and then writing down the detailed proofs for the security of our specification of this system. There's a lot of work still to do here. In particular, the paper is in submission and the prototype will be coming soon as we can find an interested master's student who wants to implement it. I don't know if there's any of them in the room. There's probably a few. Come and talk to me afterwards if you're interested in getting involved. So what about future work in this area? So this end-to-end encryption for cloud storage is really an emerging application. There's all these small vendors around, potentially offers enhanced security and privacy for users' data. There's a lot of previous research in this domain. See the related work section of our paper, but it really doesn't seem to have bled through into practice and influenced how practice is done today in this space. So we would like to try to do better, and so we're moving on now from breaking these kinds of systems to making them. I mean, as long as people keep proposing, we'll keep breaking them for them, but eventually we want to step into this different way of thinking about let's try and build secure systems. Our new system offers all of the required core functionality to make something functional, but there's a lot more advanced features and security properties that you could add, and here I think it'd be really worthwhile talking to some of our industry partners here about what kind of features they would see as being important for such systems. A final question, one thing we've talked about internally quite a lot is whether having a standardized approach to this problem would be helpful. There's the old XKCD cartoon that says, we have 12 standards for X, we should do better, and then you end up with a 13th standard for the same thing. Here, we're in the situation where there is no standard that I'm aware of for end-to-end encryption for cloud storage, so we'd be going from 0 to 1 instead of from 12 to 13, and I think that's a positive step rather than a negative one. So I think this could potentially help, and this would be an interesting thing to talk to some of you about, your experiences of standardization in this space. So let me just end by leaving you with my contact details and a nice picture of my research group. This is us, I think, I don't know exactly when this was. The trees are green, so it must have been, maybe it was in the spring last year. If you're interested in this kind of research, please do come and talk to us. Many of the group are here. I can see them sitting in the back row there. We'd be pleased to tell you more. Thanks a lot.